Today is March 6, 2003, and we are interviewing Mrs. Stella Faria at her old home house in Pinole, California, for the Rosie the Riveter project. And my name is Judith Dunning, and I'll be doing the interviewing, and Catherine Stein is doing the videoing. And good afternoon.
Hi, welcome to our home,
Thank
our
you.
old home.
Thank you very much. What is your full name?
Stella Marie. My maiden name was Freitas, and I'm now Faria.
What year were you born?
1926,
Where were you born?
right here in Pinole.
Do you know where your parents were born?
Yes, my mother was born in a small town in northern Portugal. My father was also from that area, different city. He was born in a larger city called Guimarães, which is a university city in Portugal. And they left when my mother left with her aunt to Rio de Janeiro to help her out with her young children, sort of a nanny type job. And she met my father there, who had gone to school. He was a bookkeeper and had gone to Rio de Janeiro. They met and married there.
Well, that sounds like it'll probably be a whole story in itself, and we may be coming back to you because there is a Portuguese project going on at UC Berkeley.
Oh, really?
But I'm just going to ask you a few brief questions. Did your parents tell you many stories about what their life was like growing up in Portugal?
Since my father was killed in an explosion at Hercules Powder Company when I was just a toddler, I didn't hear anything from him, but my mother told us stories.
Mm-hmm. Any that stand out in your mind?
Well, she was from a large family, and they lived in a very rural part of northern Portugal. And everything was, everything centered around their family life and raising a crop. They sort of lived off the land.
Do you know how old your parents were when they left Portugal?
I don't know how old my father was, but they were close in age, within a couple of years, so he probably left when he was 18 or 19. And I think she was 17 or 18 when she left.
Mm-hmm. And did they tell you how they happened to leave? Where were they? They were in Buenos Aires?
No, Rio de
Janeiro,
Brazil.
Oh, okay. They were in
went
Brazil.
to Brazil, which,
Mm-hmm.
Was
the
Portuguese
Portuguese
colony.
speaking, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And did they tell you why they came to this area?
It was 1925 that they came, and that was when the height of immigration, I think, to this country, and everyone had, a dream of finding wealth and happiness in this land of opportunity, although they were well off in Rio de Janeiro. My father was a successful businessman. They had what would be similar to a general store. And my mother had household help. She helped him in the store, but she had household help. I had a cook and a nanny for my two sisters when they were babies. So they had a comfortable life, but my father was more adventurous, I think, than my mother, and he wanted to come to America badly, so they did.
And do you know if they came specifically to this area because there were other Portuguese people?
No, they entered at Ellis Island.
Oh, really?
Came on a freighter.
Oh, boy.
And I can't remember the name of the ship now. But anyway, they did come on a freighter and landed at Ellis Island, came by train cross country, which is hard for me to imagine doing myself with two babies, because my two older sisters were just infants. They were babes in arms in their passport pictures. So they traveled cross country, barely knowing the English language, which was amazing too. But they did have some relatives here. I had an aunt in Sacramento, and my mother had a cousin in this area. And they had arranged for my father to work at Hercules Powder Company. So when they arrived, they came right here to Pinole and lived in Pinole a short time, then moved into one of the little company houses in Hercules. Some of those are now, those old Victorians or Queen Anne's, whatever they are restored, and we lived in one of those when we were.
You lived there
little.
as long as your dad worked
Yes.
at the company?
And for a short time after he passed away, the company let my mother stay. And then we moved to a house down here on this lower street below the hill we lived on, and later grew up, stayed there until about 1936, I think, and then my mother remarried, and I had a stepdad, and they bought a house on the other side of the highway, but still here in Pinole.
Okay.
So I was here all of my young life.
Okay. Now you mentioned there were 4 sisters. Now, are they all from the same mother and father?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And were you second from the youngest, or were you?
I'm second from the youngest.
Oh, okay. Okay, so
The
you.
2 older ones came over from Brazil, and they arrived here in 25. I was born in 26, and my younger sister was born in 28. So my mother had had 4 girls within 6 years.
Can you describe a typical day for your mother when all the children were at home and young?
Yes, I can. I remember so well. We lived in a house down on Quinnen Street below us here, and it had a huge bedroom. And there were 2 double beds, so there were 2 of us in each bed. And my mother got us up for school in the morning. We got ourselves dressed, and she always had breakfast ready for us. We didn't fix our own breakfast. I think we were a little bit spoiled. She was a typical homemaker. That's all she did was provide good meals for us and keep us well fed. She was a wonderful cook and enjoyed cooking.
Did she cook mostly Portuguese food? Or?
Well, she was used to the cooking from her own family, so she had that influence, but then she picked up that Brazilian influence, so it was kind of a combination of those 2 cultures. Because the Brazilian food is a lot spicier and a little different from.
Do you remember any favorite meals?
Well, yes, every Sunday she cooked a big pot roast, and we'd go to the little meat market here in town, and she'd give us $1 and tell us to go to the butcher shop and pick up a $1 pot roast, and the butcher knew that's how much we had for a piece of meat, and we always got a Frankfurter from the butcher as a little treat he handed us after we bought whatever my mother sent us over for. We always got a Frankfurter. I think we were always anxious to run to the butcher shop because we knew we were going to get that.
Would you get one each, or just
Well,
whoever
if
went?
one or if 2 of us went, we each got one. But my mother was a good cook, and she always fixed a nice roast, and she had potatoes roasted in with the meat, and sometimes she'd put carrots in, and we always had a vegetable garden. There was an empty lot next to ours, and I don't know if it belonged to the property or not, but no one ever questioned the fact that people, raised vegetables there. And we always had chickens or rabbits, which, supplemented our meals.
How would you describe your mother? What did she look like?
Well, everyone says now that I look a lot like her as I've gotten older. She had dark brown eyes, and my hair used to be very dark, and she had very dark hair. She was a small, we're all about the same size, about 5'2", and she was probably that, no taller than that. And she was healthier in later years, but she had some real problems after my father was killed. She developed a lung tumor, and our little country doctor here in town, Dr. Fernandez, took her into Providence Hospital in Oakland, found, because my mother didn't have the finances, you know, to take care of something that major, even in those days, and found a thoracic surgeon to operate on her at Providence Hospital in Oakland, and she was there for something like 2 months. So neighbors took care of us. We were little, all small at the time. A next door neighbor, a couple who had no children, took my younger sister and I, and a friend up the street who had a daughter the same age as my older sister, took her, and Celeste was taken in by a lady who had been like a right arm to my mother when she had, you know, problems losing her husband and being so new to the country and, you know, not able hardly to speak the language and not able to really fend for herself. And this lady, Mrs. Enos, her name was, I'm named after her, Stella Enos, just, you know, would take us for medical visits to the dentist. She took us to have our tonsils out, and she was always there for my mother. Just a wonderful woman.
Even after your mom recovered.
Yeah, and she took Celeste. Celeste stayed with her, so we were separated, but all, you know, close by.
So your mother must have only been in her 20s then?
Yeah, close to, let's see, she was born 90. She was close to 30.
Okay. And did you ever find out what was wrong with her?
She had it was a lung tumor, but this doctor removed it successfully, whatever they had to do, and I don't know the details, but she told us later she never got a bill. Never saw a bill.
Were you able to visit her at all?
No.
I know the rules have really changed in hospitals. So.
No, we didn't see her while she was there. I don't remember seeing her. My older sisters might have been able to go, but I don't remember seeing her. In fact, she had a problem with nasal hemorrhages, and she was at the old Cottage Hospital in Richmond, and I think it was Celeste went to see her, and she had her nose packed, and she remembers that vividly, you know, how scary it was for a child to see her mother, you know, in that condition.
Well, it seems like you had a lot of upheaval.
Yeah, my mother was a strong, strong person. She endured some really hard times. When my father died, in those days, they didn't have, you know, insurance policies or liability or things like that. So Hercules Powder Company let her stay in the house for a short time, and I think she said they paid the burial expenses at Wilson and Kratzer in Richmond, and I think she had something like $120 or something that they gave her for a few months, and she said, you know, it wasn't enough for her to manage on. So the house was big. She took in boarders, and she did laundry for the office workers at Hercules. There were a lot of bachelors who, you know, wore white shirts and needed someone to do their laundry, and so she did that. And until she remarried, you know, she made all of our clothes, you know, and usually from hand-me-downs. People gave her things, and
she was resourceful.
Yes, she was.
Yeah. Well, you were only 2 going on 3
Yeah.
when your father died. What kind of stories did you hear about that?
I remember the only thing I recall about my father was on payday. The people from Hercules got their paychecks and they came downtown to cash their checks. And he always brought us a Hershey bar. And I remember it was a 2-story old Victorian, and I remember us as little children lining up there by the door waiting for him to come home with that 5-cent Hershey bar.
Should we put it on pause
We
while
could,
it's
yeah.
playing?
Oh, I'm
do that.
sorry.
Oh, that's
I told him.
And we're back on the video.
okay. Do you know the circumstances of your father's death? Were there other people killed in the explosion?
Oh, one other man, and we had a copy of the Oakland Tribune front page article about the explosion. And there were, I think, 2 other men involved, but not killed. It was, he worked on the he was the foreman on the nitroglycerin, at the nitroglycerin plant. And my understanding is that they wheeled these little buggies with nitroglycerin up this little pathway to the top of this knoll, and evidently I don't know if it was automated in any way, but these little carts went up this path, and one cart would go up and another one would come down. The empty one would be coming down, and there was some sort of incident there that caused, and I understand nitroglycerin's very sensitive, so evidently, and they had more than a few, I think, explosions there in that nitroglycerin plant.
During your childhood?
Later on.
Yeah. Well, do you remember having special household chores as a child?
We did. We had to, we helped with, there were 4 of us, and we took turns doing different kitchen duties. We had to make our beds, which we didn't always do. And we argued a lot about whose turn it was to do what in the kitchen. If it was your turn to wash dishes, you might not want to wash, and you'd bargain with your sister to dry instead, or to wash for her the next day. We argued a lot about whose turn. We always claimed that somebody cheated on, their turn, and if later on when we were older and we had things we'd rather do than be washing dishes, if we had a friend that wanted to do something with us, we made all kinds of excuses. My poor mother ended up half the time doing it just to keep peace in the household. You can imagine, with 4 girls and a mother, that's a lot of females in one house.
Well, your father died right at the height of the Depression.
Yes, 1929.
That must have been a really rough time. And did you understand, that your family was having a rough time, or you being only 2,
Yes.
maybe that was...
No, because I was, right after, say around 1930, I would have been 4, and then within those few years after, that's when everyone really was suffering. In 1929, it was, the crash, but I don't think anyone felt it immediately, except for the people who had money and had lost their fortunes, but we didn't have a fortune to lose, so that wasn't our big concern. It was just a matter of existing. But I do remember that I had this aunt that I had from Sacramento later, who lived in Vallejo, and my uncle, her husband, worked for PG&E, I think, and I remember them going to the bank and being concerned about whether or not they were going to be able to get the money that they had. And that was one thing that kind of stood out in my mind. You know, why, if you had money in the bank, wouldn't you be able to get it? And I don't know what. I remember us being over in Vallejo with my aunt and uncle, and I remember them, you know, talking, the adults talking amongst themselves, and it didn't make sense to me. I was too young to really understand what was going on.
And do you think growing up during that era affected you later? You know, growing up during the Depression?
Yeah, I think it made me understand the value of money a lot better, and understand the value of friends, because my mother needed help a lot, and people really came to her rescue.
Now, were there other Portuguese Americans, or
yes,
just...
Pinole had a lot of Portuguese and Italian and Irish. I think the whole community was made up of Portuguese, Italian, and Irish. And there were, you know, farmers, and out in the valley, my husband's parents, grandparents, both farmed the Pinole Valley out here. His paternal grandparents, the Farias, farmed on the left side of the valley, and his maternal grandparents, the Roses, farmed where the just this side of Pinole Valley High School, that area. So there were lots of Portuguese people in this area.
And was your family tight with that community? Did your social life revolve around the Portuguese community?
There were lodges, you know, there were Portuguese lodges, and they had lots of social activities, and we had what they call the Holy Ghost celebration. I don't know if you've ever heard of those. That's a Portuguese celebration that's held usually in the spring, and they have a queen who represents the queen who supposedly sold her jewels to feed the poor, and they have a feast of they call it soupas. It's not really soup, but they make a beef. They cook beef overnight, long for hours and hours, and make this broth, and they pour it over French bread, and then they cut the meat up and they serve that to everyone.
And this would be right in Pinole?
Right here in Pinole, just down the hall. Portuguese Hall was just down at the foot of the hill here.
And did you speak Portuguese at home?
Yes, we did. I spoke Portuguese and took a class at UC from a Portuguese professor who was here from Brazil, and he used to laugh at my accent because he said, I can tell that you're not Brazilian, and I can tell that you're not from Portugal, because my parents were from the continent. And the Portuguese from the Azores have an entirely different dialect. But my parents were both from the continent, but he could tell that I had a mixture.
So are you still fluent in Portuguese?
I can manage it, but I don't get to use it. I was a language major at Cal, and I took French, Spanish, and Portuguese all at the same time. Sometimes used to throw in words in the wrong
So
file.
you must be very good in languages.
I loved languages. I had intended to be an interpreter, but didn't do that.
I'm going to just, looking back on your childhood, are there things that you learned that you still value today?
Lots of things. I went to school at the little elementary school up on the hill on the backside of that big eucalyptus grove, and it was 8 grades, and we had wonderful teachers who looked out for us personally. You know, they knew, because it was a small town, they knew our parents, and they knew what was expected of us at home, and so they really, really, I think, shaped and molded the children who went there. And when we went to Richmond High, we had a first grade teacher who had a little willow stick, and she wrote beautifully. It just didn't even look like it was done by hand, and she expected perfect penmanship. So she, and I think in those days most teachers did do that. You had to just make perfect little circles and lines through the circles, and if you weren't holding your pencil right, she tapped your knuckle. And when we went, the students from Pinole who went on to Richmond High sort of stood out, and there were lots of teachers that used to say, I can tell which kids in my class came from Pinole, because we did have some very, very strict teachers who demanded a lot, but really, you know, we should be thankful to them because they did a wonderful job.
And what was the name of your school?
Pinole Hercules.
Oh, okay. So it was
Pinole Hercules Grammar School.
Mhm.
And then I went on to work for the principal and the superintendent in 48. I worked for Miss Collins. There's a school named after her here.
Oh, yes.
Margaret Collins School.
Well, I was going to ask you a bit about some of your memories of Pinole, but I think maybe you addressed a number of those. But one thing I might add is who lived in your neighborhood when you first moved?
I was born in a house over by the present fire department, and I didn't know any neighbors there because I was too small. I remember living in Hercules, as I say, because we looked forward to my father coming home with a Hershey bar every payday. But there was a little park right in the middle of Hercules, and the children all played there, and we just had, when I think back, being only 3 years old, 4 years old, we had a lot of freedom. We just roamed the whole area and were perfectly safe. We could do, you know, and every neighbor knew everyone else, and everyone looked out for everyone else. So it was great growing up in that kind of an environment.
And you knew when you went to the elementary school that you'd probably be going to Richmond Union High School?
Yes, because there were no other schools here, just the elementary school. And then we went to Roosevelt Junior High from here.
Oh, okay. So after the 8th grade?
We went to Roosevelt Junior High for the 9th, and then 10, 11, 12 at Richmond High. And we rode on a school bus, and because we had a distance to go, the bus picked us up around 7 in the morning, sometimes 6:45. They would change our schedule. We were sort of the end of the line, so they started here, and sometimes we went out through the Giant Road around the back there, picked up in San Pablo and then on to Richmond High. Other times we went through El Sobrante and down the Dam Road and around the back side to Richmond High. So we took circuitous routes to get to Richmond High, but we left early in the morning.
And what time would you finally arrive at school?
Well, we'd get there in time. We got there earlier than most of the other kids, so we'd go to a study hall, and if we hadn't finished our homework, we had a little time to do some extra work.
And how was that transition when you went from Pinole to Richmond? Had you had any experience in Richmond before?
We had to do our shopping in Richmond because there were no stores here in Pinole, so everyone from Pinole was familiar with Richmond.
And where would you go in Richmond?
There was a department store called Albert's on the corner of 9th, I guess, are they?
9th and McDonald?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you knew Richmond when McDonald Ave was booming?
Yes, I worked at the National Dollar Store, and that was, you know, about the time that Richmond was beginning to get really busy, and lots of people were shopping for work clothes, and the National Dollar Store was, that type of store that carried just very basic, type things, and I was probably 14 and a half, 15. You could get a work permit at that age. They called it a special work permit, and so I worked there, and then went on to shipyards later.
Now, do you have any recollections of what Richmond looked like before the war?
Yes, the area between Richmond High and downtown Richmond, after school, we could walk just practically, at a straight angle into town. Most of that housing that came, during and after the war was built in that area between Ream, I'd say between Ream and Nevin, or between Ream and Roosevelt. That section was pretty empty.
And what was the population of your high school? Do you know how many students were in your class?
I have forgotten, and I have worked on my class reunion
No,
all
that's
these years. After 50-something years, I have forgotten how many were in our class. We lost a lot of our graduating class because they went into the service. They knew they were going to be drafted, so that they would have a choice. A lot of them enlisted in the Navy and Marines, whatever, Air Force, so that they would have a choice.
Now, before we really seriously get into the war years, I wondered, what was the face of, like, your junior high school? I had heard that, there were very few African American families in Richmond before the war. There were about 15, right. But there were a number of other ethnic groups. And what is your recollection of that?
Well, when I went to Roosevelt Junior High, it was a big change, coming from a little school where everyone knew everyone else. But Richmond was a very close-knit community. And there were two junior highs, Longfellow and Roosevelt, which is now the Gompers continuation. And Longfellow was over on 23rd Street, and the students there came from the Mira Vista, East Richmond Heights, that area up on the hill. So we always felt like they were the elite, because they lived up on the hill. And anyone who went to Longfellow Junior High sort of acted like they were better than those who went to Roosevelt Junior High. There was kind of a little class distinction there.
Even then?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But those who did go to Roosevelt Junior High were a close-knit group, and we had a lot of Mexican families whose parents, worked for the railroad. Mm-hmm. And I had several friends who worked with me at the dollar store and went on. I knew them all through school, and I still know V. Alcaraz, who went all through. I met her in junior high, and then she went through high school with me.
Well, we may ask you a little bit about that later, if there are any, other contacts from those early days, because that would be particularly interesting. Well, Richmond was 23,000 people, and then in just a few years it was 125,000 people.
128 or so, they said, I think.
Could you just see this happening all of a sudden, or was it more gradual?
Well, I suppose if you looked at each specific change, you might notice it more, but like if you were shopping, you'd notice more people, or if you went to the movies were more crowded. But generally speaking, I didn't notice a tremendous change from, 25 to 125 or whatever. It just, it happened fast, I know that. And my first job at the shipyards was that section I worked in handled finding some housing because people were coming in so, quickly. And that, and they were in charge of finding, getting deferments for people that were in jobs that were critical, more critical than others. So the fact that there wasn't housing was obvious, I think.
Did people move up to Pinole, this whole area too?
We didn't notice much of a change, I don't think, here, because there was no government housing, so there was just the same limited number of homes available here. So unless people had moved out and someone came in and rented, we basically stayed pretty much the same.
Right. I know that there were a lot of people who took in boarders, or they'd have what's called a sleeping room, and the bed would always be warm.
Yeah.
Because every 8 hours, the sleeping shift would change.
Somebody else would come in. No, I don't know that was a common thing here.
How about trailers? I know there were some trailer camps on San Pablo Ave.
Yes, in San Pablo there were trailer parks, but nothing like that here in Pinole. We did, there was a sense of edginess because there were so many immigrants here that they might, and especially after they moved Japanese out of the area, then there were threats that the Italians, because of their connection with Germany, that there might be Italians moved out of the area. And we had neighbors, the Gozzanos, who, the poor people, they were, maybe they weren't that old, they seemed old to me, but at that time they were so upset, it just made her ill, because they were afraid they were going to be moved, and this was a pretty frightening thing.
And did you know any Italians that were moved?
Not from here in Pinole.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier that you had a Japanese American student. You went to high school with her. Would you tell us that story?
Yes, we had been in high school just a short time, and she was in my French class, and our teacher was Miss Swenson, and the phone rang in the classroom. She went to the phone and answered it and went over to, the girl's name was Junko Maeda, and she went over to Junko and she told her that she was wanted downstairs in the office. And so she picked up her books. She told her to take her things. And she picked up her books and she left and didn't come back in before the class ended. So the bell rang. I went to my locker and she was there. And she was, I think, typically Japanese. She was trying to, not show her emotions. And I could tell something was wrong, and I asked her what was wrong, and she was real teary-eyed, and she said that they were being relocated. She and her family had to move, and it didn't quite, set in. I thought, why does she have to live? She's from here, from Richmond, and then I got thinking, well, there's war on, and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. I guess, they do have to get them out of here. But it still didn't make sense. And never heard from her again, never saw her again until I was working on my own class reunion, and had gone to a reunion that my husband's class had a year before, and I heard someone say that there was someone named Maeda there, so I went over to her and I said, "Are you by chance related to Junko, or do you know someone named Junko?" And she said, "Yes, she's my sister-in-law." And I told her who I was and that she had been in my class before they were relocated, and she gave me her address, and I called her, and we really didn't have anything in common to talk about, and it was such a sensitive matter that I didn't really know how to approach it. I felt so bad, and I could tell by her voice that she was emotionally, upset. And I told her that I was working on our reunion, and I said, "Do you think you'd want to come?" And she said, "Gee, it's so nice of you to even think of inviting me." But she said, "I don't know anybody. I never kept in touch with anyone." And she said I would feel so awkward coming. And she did ask me about one classmate, Jean Heilman, who had gone all through school here in Pinole with me, and she had become friendly with Jean Heilman, and the last I'd heard about Jean, she had moved to Texas, and I didn't even have an address to give her and had no way of getting any more information to her. But we had a little conversation, and I told her that it just really stayed, in my mind, and affected me in a real hard way.
And this was This was your 50th high school reunion, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so you never saw Junko
No,
again.
never saw
And
her.
where is she now?
She was living in a home above I think that's called College Highlands, above Contra Costa College. That section over, is that Fairmead? Below Fairmead.
So she's still in the area.
She was there then, and I don't...
It's almost 10 years now.
Yeah.
Well, do you know any other people that were interned?
We knew all the families, Japanese families in Richmond, because they all went to Richmond High. Is that bothering? Do you want to shut that
Yeah,
off?
maybe just wait a second. We're back on the video.
Well,
yes,
thank
there
you.
were lots of Japanese families. There was one family that owned the park florist, and their name was Miyamoto. And of course the Adachis that have still in the area, that family was there. There were lots of Japanese farmers out in that area, North Richmond. Well, just that's not really considered. I guess it is North Richmond out there. And that's where most of them had either rose gardens or, flower gardens, hothouses out there.
And did you notice when suddenly there were no Japanese around?
Yeah, it was pretty obvious. There was another family of Katayanagis, Katayanagi, and one of them came back to Richmond and had a good job at Chevron. There were quite a few, the Hondas.
Well, it seems like that experience with your Japanese high school mate really made a deep impression.
It really did, and I don't know why, but it did. And there were just a few, in my own graduating class, there were only a few African Americans, and there was, the Ellisons were a well-known black family. Doug Ellison was a boxer, and his mother worked for DMV, I think, Department of Motor Vehicles. She was an old-timer in Richmond, and there were just a handful of them.
The Graves family, I know that they were pretty big.
But most of them lived in the North Richmond area, and aside from the African Americans, there were mostly Italians, farmers. out in
Right
that
before
area.
the war.
Yeah, out in that area off of where the American Standard plant is out there on Giant Road. Is that Giant Road? Yeah, I guess.
Yes. Well, you certainly went to high school during quite a time of transformation in the United States. You graduated in 1944.
44.
And you mentioned that you could get special work permits at age 14, so
Yes.
that's when you worked for the National Dollar. And then between junior and senior year in high school, that's the first time you went to work in the shipyard?
Right.
And will you tell me a little bit about how you got that job?
I don't remember if they had notices at school, but because there was such a shortage of help with everyone going off to war, I think they advertised that there were jobs open at the shipyards, and I always worked. I mean, we all did in my family whenever there was a chance to work. I babysat infants when I was 11 years old, and always had a job. And before I worked at the dollar store, I worked in the soda fountain here in town in the drugstore and babysat all the time. So I always seemed to have a job. And whether it was advertised at high school or whether it was word of mouth, I knew that they were hiring. And so the minute school was out, I applied and got a job at Yard Number 1, and that's the office that handled veteran exemptions and housing. And that's where I worked for a gentleman. He was Dutch. His name was Dirk Feenstra. He was an engineer, I think. And I picked up, I had one time in the afternoon where I had to go out and pick up time cards in the yard. So I walked through the yard, so I was pretty much aware of all these huge, ships being built.
Well, was that a desirable position that you had, working in the office?
I think, yeah.
Was it more difficult to get those jobs?
Well, I don't know. Maybe they were particular about who. I was a good student in school and always had, good grades, but I don't know that had a whole lot of bearing. They were so desperate for help that just it seemed like anybody who wanted to work could work in those days.
And did you ever consider working, building the ships?
No, I didn't. It just seemed like it was a noisy, dirty, real hard. I felt sorry for the people who were doing the job because I rode to work with 3 gentlemen from town here. I didn't, I couldn't drive. I couldn't have afforded a car if I wanted one. So I rode with these 3 gentlemen who worked out in the yard, and one of them seemed quite old. I don't know how old but he worked there, and his son also worked there, rode with us. And they just seemed like they had a hard, long day, when we left in the afternoon. I don't think I would have enjoyed having to work as hard as they were working. It was hard work. And you could tell the women that were out there working, with their lunch pails and, dressed in jeans, or some of them that were welders had those leather pants and their hair tied up in bandanas. They just looked so weary, and they really looked like they were drained and exhausted at the end of their work day.
And in Shipyard Number 1, where you were working, who else worked in the office?
I really don't remember what the total crew was, because there were people doing different things and people in and out of the office. It was a busy place because it seemed like people were on the phone all the time trying to find housing. That was a big thing at that time, to try to find housing for people that were coming into the area that wanted to work at the shipyards but needed a place to live.
Well, what I'm wondering is if in your office, if it was mostly made up of people like yourself or people that were born and raised in this area, and then the people that migrated from the South and Midwest, would they be the ones that would actually be working on the ships?
I think that the people in the offices were mostly people who were, residents of the area and were schooled here. I think they're the ones that took those office jobs. I don't know whether there was any preference shown, but I don't remember even meeting people who were new to the area in that office. I remember that I worked for Mr. Feenstra, and I remember all these other people at desks, but I worked from the time school was out in June, and I was back in September, so I didn't have a long, period of time to get it really acquainted. I just went in, did my job and everything I was asked to do, and made sure I did it well, because I didn't want to lose that job. It was, that was a good way to make some fast money.
So in your day-to-day work there wasn't too much connection with the people who were working on the ships, other than, you said, collecting the time cards?
Not in that shipyard number 1. It was, just seemed like, in fact, we were outside of the yard at the front and on cutting there, and the office was a 2-story wood frame building right there at the entrance.
And what kind of sense did you have about what was actually happening, in the shipyards?
I don't think I really realized that there was so much activity and that ships were just being built and sent down the way so fast that it was, looking back, it's unbelievable almost that they could have built those ships as fast as they did. It was, I realized when I went out into the yard to pick up time cards that it was noisy and that there were people just hustling and bustling. Everyone seemed to be just flying. Didn't see anyone sitting around. If you sat around, you probably didn't have your job the next day, I think, because they really were on a tight, tough schedule.
And did you get a sense that it was the 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week operation?
Well, I was probably more concerned with my little 8-hour day shift, but I was aware of the fact that these people were working hard, really working hard.
And tell me a little bit about McDonald Ave during the shipyard years.
Well, there were a few soda fountains and a Conn's drugstore on 23rd and Conn's drugstore on 10th and McDonald were popular places because they had a soda fountain, and the kids all, went there for sodas and cones, and they had a chocolate dip cone, I think which was new at the time, and then there was, I remember Blumenfield's was another department store farther down, I think on about 6th, and then Albert's was like a mini Macy's. It was a neat little store, had a shoe department, and they seemed to carry nice things for a store in those days. And Garfinkel's was another, more of a boutique-y type, a store that had more suits and dresses and even some furs. Had furs, bad thing.
Now, would you go to the movie theaters there?
Mm-hmm.
Because I heard they were open 24 hours a day.
Yes. And my sister-in-law, one of my sisters-in-law, who lives up in Reading, came during the shipyard days from Texas. And she worked for years at United Grocers in Richmond. And she was telling me that one of the fellows that she worked with, named Fisher, told her that there were 19 little theaters besides the big theaters that showed just newsreels. Have you ever heard that story?
Well, I've mostly heard the stories where the shipyard workers who couldn't find housing would go in and sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And I have heard quite a bit about newsreels.
Yeah. She said that he told her, and he's a native Richmonder, that there were 19 little theater things where they showed just the newsreels to keep you posted on what was happening in the war. And that was the first I heard of that. So I told her I would tell you about it, but I didn't know that. The Fox Theater was on McDonald, and down on 6th or 8th down was the State. That was the State Theater. And that one was the one, I think they were a little fussier about kicking people out of the Fox, because the other one was known to have more people sleeping. And it was, whenever they talked about going to a movie, they'd say, well, it's playing at the Fox, you can go see it, don't go down to the Flea House. And they called it the Flea House because they claimed that there were so many people sleeping there that it became kind of not the best place to go watch a movie.
Well, how much interaction did you have, as a high school student with all the newcomers in Richmond?
They just kind of melded in, They, it seemed like they were always there to me. I didn't really feel that there were newcomers.
And I know you mentioned that you lost a number of high school boys who enlisted,
Mm-hmm.
including, I think, your boyfriend.
Well, one of them went, yeah.
One of your boyfriends, and
I wasn't that serious about any of them, but
your sister's husband, and
Sorry, we're gonna be out pretty soon.
okay, want to start? You want to start a new one?
Yeah, why don't
Okay.
we do that? I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right. We're gonna put on a new tape, and
Okay.
and then we'll, we're moving right away. Well, we were talking about some of your sister's fiance and husband enlisting, and then one of your boyfriends
they didn't enlist, they were drafted. My classmates enlisted, a lot of them enlisted, because they didn't want to be drafted into the Army, because if you didn't enlist, you automatically were drafted into the Army. So my older sister had just recently been married. Her husband was drafted. My sister Celeste's husband was drafted. She was not married at the time. It was her fiance. And my boyfriend, my present husband, were all drafted and called in at the same time. The draft board in Richmond handled, Judge Horner handled the drafting call, and they were all notified at the same time, all left on the same day, and went down to the Presidio in Monterey. And so my stepdad, who was a wonderful father to us, drove us down to Monterey so we could have one last fond farewell. And so we all said our goodbyes there at the Presidio. My brother-in-law, my older sister's husband, ended up in the Air Force. They switched him over, and he went to Truax Field in Wisconsin. I think it was Truax. But anyway, he went to Wisconsin. My husband went to, my now husband, boyfriend, then went to Florida to Tent City, was called Tent City, St. Petersburg, Florida, and my brother-in-law Harold, who became my brother-in-law later, ended up in Florida too. He went to Texas first, and it was by coincidence that my husband was in a chow line and my brother-in-law came through, and they ran ran into one another and then ran into one another again in Texas, at Fort Hood, I think. So then my husband shipped out, he was still my boyfriend then, went on the Queen Mary over to England. And he said it was a real zigzaggy route because of the submarines, dangerous submarines. And then he ended up over in Germany. He went over just at the end of the war, and then got out in 46, and we were married in 47.
So you had mentioned earlier that they were drafted in 1943.
Yes.
So you were only about 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And how about your future husband?
He's 3 years older.
And did you have much communication with him when he was gone?
Wrote to him every day. Just practically every day.
And do you know if he got most of the letters?
Yeah, he did. And cookies, care packages, everyone sent, things from home. That was important at that time, to try to keep in touch. And everyone baked and sent things from home. So he did get all of my letters, and he was pretty good about writing too. I don't think men are as good about communicating as women, but he did write a lot.
And my next big question is, did you save those letters?
No, I didn't. I should have. After a while it becomes clutter. You save, and then when you get to he'll be 80 in May, and I'll be 77 soon, and you just accumulate a lot of stuff in all those years. And when we moved from here, I think I still had a lot of them in our downstairs storage area, and we just had to get rid of things,
Did you save a one?
No, I don't have any.
How about, did you ever keep a journal or a diary during that time?
No, I didn't. I was so busy either going to school or working. I think I wanted so badly to finish Cal, and my parents couldn't afford, to send me. So I knew that I had to make enough money for books and tuition, which seemed like a whole lot of money in those days. By today's standards, it was just, peanuts. But, $26 for tuition and $2 and I bought all my books used, at the used bookstores, but it's still, and I had to ride the Greyhound bus, so I had to buy bus tickets, and I knew that I had to make enough, during my summer stints, and I took all kinds of jobs. When I was going to Cal, one of my friends who lived in a sorority, they used to post all these little jobs that were available, and she was a good sport, and she'd do anything I wanted to do, and we used to go into Oakland, and we did inventory at Capwell's and at Hale Brothers, and we dig under those sliding door counters underneath and pull out stuff that had probably been there, we thought, for 50 years, but we had to count it, and it was dusty. We did some really tacky jobs, but we did whatever we thought we could earn a few dollars at.
Well, and you made it through 2 years at UC?
Mm-hmm. And then I just felt like I couldn't. The commute was, I think, getting to me more than anything else, because my classes were getting more demanding, and I really needed library time. We didn't have a library here. We had a little branch county library that was a little one-room thing that catered, I think, mostly to children, with children's books, nothing that we could use for research. And I just didn't have, if I stayed and went to the library, I knew that I was going to get a late bus, and then I'd be lucky if I got on the bus, because the buses were so crowded and full of servicemen, and if there were servicemen aboard, they were supposed to have preference, for seating, and there were always gentlemen that would get up and say, you know, take my seat, but usually the bus was so crowded that half the time I stood. And I was so tired by the time I got home, and, you know, and in the rainy winter weather, it was really drudgery. And I decided I just couldn't do it anymore.
Was that a pretty tough decision for you?
Yeah, it was. It was. But I had a job right away. I went to work as a dental assistant and worked at that, and those were still, you know, busy times in Richmond. We had just, I worked for Dr. Collins downtown, and he had probably every doctor and dentist had a overcapacity practice in those days, and we worked hard. I did everything. I did the bookkeeping, I did, you know, appointments, I did chairside assisting, I cast inlays, I did the x-rays, developed them, did the whole 9 yards in that office. And that's what jobs were in those days. If you got a job working in an office, it didn't mean that you sat at a desk and did an office, you know, a typical secretarial job. You did a lot of extra things if you wanted a job, you know, a good job.
Well, I'd like to also hear a little bit more about your work in Shipyard 2 and 3. But before that, I have one question that I ask everyone I interview. And that's about the same period of time in the 40s. You were a teenager. Did you have certain ambitions or dreams or vision of what your life might be like?
Well, I hope that it would be better than it was when I was growing up, because things were not easy when I was growing up, but I don't feel that we suffered from it. I think in a small town like Pinole, and I'm sure it was the same in Richmond, families were all going through the same hard times, and we didn't feel that we were poor or poorer than anybody else. We were kind of all in the same boat, and as long as we had a nice, comfortable home to live in, and were clothed and, you know, were fed well, I don't think that we wished for anything more than that at the time. But so I hope that, you know, someday I would have a good job, and I thought about being a language interpreter. I was always interested in foreign languages, and I thought that that would get me a good job, and that I could, you know, be successful at that. That's kind of what I dreamed of doing. And I was offered a job in Washington, D.C. My parents took me to a lodge convention type thing in Oakland, and there was a group of Portuguese Air Force and naval officers there, and met this gentleman who was a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., and then when he found out that I was a student at UC and that I spoke Portuguese and was fluent and, you know, could read and write it, he asked my parents if they would consider letting me go to work for him in Washington. Well, it sounded so glamorous, you know, but, and being from, you know, this small town, I thought, you know, the more I thought about it, the scarier it sounded, and my parents certainly weren't going to let me go to Washington to work or have me be farther than 10 miles from Pinole, let alone cross country. But and he gave me his card and told him to consider it, and told me to be sure to get in touch with him if I was interested in coming to work for him in Washington. I still have his little card. Look at it every once in a while, and I think, gee, what would have happened to me if I had done that?
Were you still in high school when you got the card, or were you a UC student?
I was already, I think I was in my first year over there. So
Well,
that's as close as I came to having a dream job besides doing what I did later.
And when did you realize you were going to marry your husband? He was off in the service.
He was off in the service, and he came home. He was discharged on Valentine's Day in '46, and he was anxious to get married. I think all of the servicemen, you know, who had been overseas and had been spent all that lonely time away from home, came back, and there were lots of marriages here in Pinole right after, you know, 46, 47, and 48. We had grown up close as neighbors. He just lived across the creek when I lived over on Peach Street. And so I was a good friend of one of his sisters. He's from a family of 7, and his sister Eleanor was a good friend of mine. So never did see much of him because he milked cows on his grandmother's ranch, the Faria ranch, just across the freeway there. And so I never did see very much of him. And the neighborhood kids used to get together after dinner and go play baseball out in the big lot out in the pasture. And one night he came down after he was, evening, he came down after he was through milking the cows, and he had a bicycle. Not very many kids had bicycles, you know, that was a luxury in those days. And so he had this old bicycle that had been given to him, and I said, gee, I really would love to know how to ride a bike. And I don't remember how old I was, but I was a kid. And so he said, well, I'll teach you. And so he said, here, get on. And he gave me one big push, and I went just sailing down 10th Avenue. It was, you know, sink or swim. I learned to ride a bicycle in one quick lesson. So that was my real first experience with getting to know my husband.
And what is his full name?
Clarence. He's Clarence Leland, baptized Clarence Leland, but his confirmation were Catholic name was James, so he always went by Clarence James Faria.
And are many of his family members still around in the Pinole area?
Mm-hmm. He has a sister, his older sister, who's about 84 now, is in Bellingham, Washington. Mm-hmm. He just lost a sister a year ago Christmas, and his youngest sister passed away, so he has just one sister left and 3 brothers.
Well, one of the things I also wanted to ask you, getting back to the high school years, I know you said a lot of the boys left. Did you find that you had many new students, or do you think most of the new students who came went immediately, or at high school age, went to work in the shipyards?
There were new people coming in. I didn't really pay attention, I guess, to where they were from at the time. I know we were busy with, we had things trying to help the war effort. We had a group that, a Red Cross group that did bandages after school, and there were activities that were connected with the war effort, you know, but I guess at that age you're so busy with school that you're not paying that much attention to all the things that are suddenly happening right under your nose. You just take it as they come, and it becomes just part of the program.
Well, one of the longtime residents of Richmond, who is now dead, Stanley Nystrom, his family's really old-time.
Yeah, the school named after.
Yes, and he remembers going to the post office, and people would comment on the fact that he didn't have an accent. They'd say, what kind of an accent do you have? Because everyone coming from the South and Midwest, you know, had very different accents.
That's true, and in Richmond you would have noticed it more than in Pinole, I think, because we didn't have housing for people available to people that were moving into the area as much as Richmond did. But I noticed it in classes where you'd notice an accent or a little, you know, a southern type drawl or just expressions that weren't typical to the area. But most of the kids that came in just kind of, it probably was tougher on, you know, a hard thing for them coming to an area where they didn't know anyone than it was for us just accepting them as new people.
Well, Mr. Nystrom would tell me when he would go to stores or to the post office, often people would ask him to read a letter or to address something because a lot of people who came here didn't have those skills.
That's right.
And is that something you noticed?
I didn't really notice it, but I know that there were people who were illiterate, who they said were illiterate, that came, that were really, you know, they were poor farm families. And I later had a friend here in town who said she came out with her family and they didn't go to the shipyards, they picked fruit. And she ended up, you know, very well off, but she said as a child it was really tough. You know, they'd move from farm to farm wherever they could find work because of, you know, the drought in the Midwest, and it just happened to be, you know, the timing was right. You know, they were suffering back there, so California was the end of the rainbow.
And what was the racial climate during the 40s?
As I said, there were African American families who just everyone seemed to get along with. There were no tensions that I know of. I later on worked in the 50s, worked at Richmond High, and it was I could not believe the change.
Will you talk about that?
Yes, I worked in the main office. I worked for Mr. Gray, the principal at the time, and I was doing the accounting. And it seemed like the African Americans who were in the area then were so much more aggressive and disrespectful, where the ones that I knew from the 40s were so polite and just so nice that you wanted them to be your friend. It was a big change. And then I was there in 55 and 56, and then I had our youngest son in 57, and they asked me to do some substituting. And I went back and worked in the attendance office, and that was when they had those afro hairdos, and they used those angel food cake slicers to do their hair. And one fellow came in and to the attendance office, and he had been cutting school or something. Anyway, he came in, and I asked him something in a nice way, and he took the note that he had wrapped around the tines and the angel food cake slicer, and he shoved it at me. I jumped back. It scared me to death. And I thought, if this is typical of, you know, what you have to put up with at Richmond High now, I don't want to do it anymore. I really was afraid, and the vulgarity. It just, you know, the whole picture was so different from when I was a student there that I had a hard time believing that, you know, it could change that much.
And did the atmosphere must have changed tremendously from, you know, when everybody was feeling patriotic and working together and busy, you know, really busy working to the war's over, and without notice there's this huge population of people without jobs. And were you still in the shipyards at that time? or were you already working for Dr. Collins when the war ended?
The war ended and things were still fairly normal, I thought. In 46, we were still very busy to 48. I'm trying to think when I really noticed that things were, I guess it happened gradually, and I wasn't, I can't say exactly what year it changed so much, but it did become obvious that things were not the same.
Well, I have heard from a number of people that, especially longtime residents, that they thought the new population, as soon as the jobs ended, would leave and go back to the South and Midwest. And in some cases, people did leave, but then they got a hint of California and they liked it and came back with other family members. And so the population really did remain large.
Yeah, it didn't ever go back to a decent. And I think that was kind of sad because Richmond was a really nice, clean town, and I'm not blaming ethnic groups. I know it was just what happened because of this sudden growth and then the rapid decline. But it just, I went to work in real estate in the late 70s, and we used to go down to preview properties, and I rode a bus downtown one day, and I was busy talking to my coworkers, and suddenly I opened my eyes and I had no idea where I was. We were on McDonald Avenue, and I had no idea where I was, and I knew McDonald Avenue like the back of my hand because I worked there and shopped there, and I knew every little restaurant and coffee shop and drugstore and clothing store, from Marlene's to Macy's to everything, and nothing was the same. And what wasn't torn down was boarded up, and that was a shock to me. And I thought, could this have happened so fast? Because it had been such a booming community. And when I worked for Dr. Collins, I banked every day at the Mechanics Bank and knew the area so well. And suddenly, I didn't even know where I was. It was a shock.
Well, what you're saying, I've certainly heard that before, and it seemed like people have been very sad about that, especially people that were there before the war, that the city lost its center. Now it's starting to revive a bit, but there was a big loss, and the stores moved to Hilltop, and that's different.
Yeah, it was sad. It was a really nice town, city, when it grew, but it was like small town. It was friendly and nice and everything. It was an attraction to people, and then suddenly you avoided the place if you could. It was, and
Well,
that is sad when you see a town die. It really died.
Well, I would like, before we wrap up, to go back a little bit to those other summers you worked in the shipyards. Shipyard number 2, you were in tax and accounting?
Yes, and all of the Social Security and unemployment tax, whatever taxes they had in those days, were all reported to that one central office. And everything was logged into these huge ledgers. There were no computers and, no electronic equipment to post these things on. So it was all posted into these ledgers. They were run off on sheets. I don't know what kind of machine they had. Marchant had calculators and different types of business machines, and I don't know what they were printed out on, but then they were all put in these huge ledgers, and we just had stacks and stacks and files of ledgers full of tax records. So those records were all there, and it was a busy, busy office. And I worked summer there of 40, that would have been summer of 43, 44, yeah.
And would you ever get feedback from the workers about having their federal tax taken out of their salary?
No, I think there was a PR office that handled any complaints, or the gentleman who was in charge of that accounting department, I'm sure, is the one who handled all of those little problem things that would crop up about, you know, the taxes. But I think they just, I don't know that anybody ever complained. You just expected that part of your paycheck went to taxes.
Do you remember what your paycheck was?
No, I don't, and I wish I had kept stubs. I did keep those for a long time too, but we'd love to have had one, darn. I'll ask my sisters. They both had jobs at Yard 2, and Arlette worked for Arthur May, who had, he was an administrative assistant at Yard 2, and she had a good job. She's my older sister who's in that launching picture.
Oh, okay.
And Celeste had a good job at Yard 2 also.
And were you there together? Were you ever there at the same time?
I was there during the summer, but I never was around where they were.
Okay. Okay.
Everyone carpooled. That's another thing, because of the gasoline. You carpooled, and everyone was in a ride group. So I just got a ride wherever I could hitch one, and because I was not a full-time worker. You know, if I was going to work the whole year, I would have been in a carpool. But since I was just going to work summer months, I just would ask someone if they had room in their car for those 2 or 3 months.
Coming from Pinole.
Pinole to Richmond,
right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that reminds me. I had a few questions about the rationing, and I've heard a lot of stories about lines. Everybody remembers a lot of lines in the 40s.
Lines. I remember standing in lines to try to get a pair of nylons, and there would be a rumor that Hill Brothers in Oakland, for instance, was going to have stockings on such and such a day. So everybody would hop in a car and go to Oakland. If you had a way down there, you went along for the attempt to get a pair of stockings. And the lines would go, around the block. And if you were lucky enough and you get up there and they still had stockings, you might get a pair of stockings, but you might come home empty-handed. But it was worth a try, because there just weren't any stockings to be had. Over the counter, you couldn't go, like now, buy a pair of legs at the drugstore. They were a real prize package in those days. And you stood in lines for a lot of things. There was a shortage of so many things. Even if you did have stamps to get things, they'd run out of, butter and sugar, and because people knew that it was rationed, if they could get it, they'd get it with their stamps, and whether they needed it or not, because you might not get it when you needed it if you waited.
And do you remember very many people having victory gardens?
Yes, absolutely. Everyone grew vegetables, and like I said, we had rabbits and chickens too. My sister, my youngest sister, who was just a year and a half younger than me, went to work. She was a straight A student, and she took a business course. She was a stenographer. They asked her to go to work for the district attorney as the secretary to the district attorney at their Richmond office. They had a branch office in Richmond. Before they built the county building, they were located on above Gay Vargas's Tavern on the corner of 12th and McDonald, and she worked there with some deputy DAs, and she was 17. She had a court reporting job. So
Seems like there were opportunities.
Yeah, there were. And if you were a good student and you had some skills, you could find yourself a job. You didn't have to struggle like you do now for a job.
Well, I think we could probably go on for another hour, but I promised you that we would stop around 4. But before we stop, I'd like to ask you about when you worked at the Kaiser administrative offices.
Yeah, that was at
in 1945.
Yes, and I was in Mr. Kaiser's administrative office, which was located at Shipyard Number 3, and he had a group of administrative assistants, and I worked. Mr. Fred Beachell, Bechill, was his chief administrative assistant, and I worked in his office. And we did progress reports on these big, wide typewriters. They were all done by hand, and the data would come in from all the shipyards on the ships that were being built, and then the progress reports were done there, and that's where they kept a record of what was going on in all the yards. And it was, there were some gentlemen there who later went on to other positions with Kaiser's empire when he stopped the shipbuilding. But it was kind of interesting that they knew he had an office upstairs, and he was rarely seen out there, but you knew when he was coming because there was a lot of hustle and bustle, making sure that the offices were presentable, and that in case he did come down, which he didn't do, he went upstairs, met with his administrative assistants, and then was out of there. But it was kind of an exciting day just to know that Mr. Kaiser had come out to the yards.
And did you meet him?
I saw him, but I was not in. I was a little flunky college student working for the summer. I didn't have that priority. But anyway, I did see him. He was a rather portly man, but everyone said he was very nice to work for. That he was a very, very nice person to have as boss. So never heard any complaints about him. And these gentlemen that I worked for were all, his chief honchos, sort of.
Now, I read something that you'd written about K.J. Samuels and L.A. Smith. Are those honchos you're talking about?
Yeah, L.A. Smith Jr. and K.J. Samuels and Fred Beachell were administrative assistants. And I know that when it looked like the shipyards were, going to slow down, at least, I heard that Mr. Smith was going to go to Fontana Steel, I think, or Permanente Cement, one of Kaiser's other companies. And Mr. Samuels went to the Kaiser Center in Oakland. He ended up at the Kaiser Center in Oakland. I don't know whether he went there directly from the shipyards. But he was, and I don't know what happened to Mr. Beachell, but I assume they all held positions with Kaiser Industries, after the shipyards.
Did you have an opportunity to join Kaiser Healthcare when you worked in the shipyards?
No. Since I was a part-time worker, those benefits weren't available to me.
And when they opened it up to the public in the late 40s, did you become a Kaiser member?
No, because I married in 47. My husband worked for Chevron, so I was eligible for his coverage. Never did have Kaiser. My older sister belongs to Kaiser.
Well, do you see Richmond as a historical place?
Yes, I do. There was a lot of not just the shipyards, you know, they had the Ford Motor Company was big, lots of people employed there, and we had a lot of friends who worked for Ford Motor Company, and before they moved to Milpitas, you know, they took most of their things down there. But F&P Cannery was bustling at the time. There was a lot of standard, Richmond Standard Sanitary, not the sanitary district was,
Right.
you know, came after, but the Ream was big, and American Standard was big. Trying to think of some of the others. There was a lot going on in Richmond. A lot of activity.
What do you think Richmond should be remembered for?
Well, I think maybe not just remember. I think they're famous for the shipyards. I think the shipyards really left a mark there, more than, you know, the Ford Motor Company or any of the other big things. Chevron, you know, was where most of the people found employment. The oil refineries were big employers all up and down the bay here. But the shipyards left a mark. They were unique to the area.
What's your feeling about the new Homefront National Historical Park?
I haven't been able to get down to see it, and I have to do that. But I think it's nice that they've done that, because it's, I think it's sort of a feather in the cap, Richmond's cap, to have a little recognition for what they contributed to the war effort. And that was, we just sort of took it for granted. All these ships were being built, and it provided a lot of employment, but I don't think that we realized really what that meant to the war effort. Maybe we were naive about the whole thing, and I was young, so I probably was one of them who just thought, well, they're building a lot of ships out here, and we can go to work out there, and took it for granted. But looking back, it was really you know, a boom to their economy. It just made for a lot of, the stores were just, you know, really bustling. If you went downtown to shop, you know, it was full of people, and every business seemed to be busy.
How about entertainment? Would you go to clubs in Richmond? Dancing?
I didn't go because I didn't have a car, but I had high school friends who went to the USO, you know, where they entertained troops. I had a couple of girlfriends who would go and dance, you know, with the servicemen who were in town. And I never did that because I didn't have transportation. We rode the bus to school, and otherwise we had to bum a ride.
Now, in your small write-up, you mentioned that you recalled the big explosion in Port Chicago Ammunition
Yes.
Depot, 1944. Is there something you'd like to add about that?
Well, I remember it so well because I was on the telephone, and our telephone was in the kitchen, and I lived just on the other side of the freeway, of the San Pablo Avenue here. And it just felt like the world had come to an end. It was just a massive boom. And I got off the phone, don't know who I was talking to, or maybe I had just started dialing, but don't know that I was in a conversation, but got off the phone, and we thought that we'd been hit by a bomb, you know, because it was wartime. We thought that we'd been, maybe the Japanese had dropped a bomb here, like they did in Pearl Harbor. We just were imagining all these horrible things, had no idea what was happening, but my older sister was a good friend of Charlotte Fernandez, who was Dr. Fernandez's daughter, And he's a legend here in Pinole. He was the old family doctor, and the Fernandez Mansion is still down here, you know, the historical spot. And he was called immediately. I think all of the doctors in the area were called immediately. And Charlotte, his daughter, who was my older sister's best friend, called to tell her that her father had was called up to Port Chicago, that there was a terrible explosion and that there were they didn't know, they thought hundreds of people killed. It was terrible. So we knew fairly soon that, and I don't know that there was anything on the radio immediately, but the boom was terrible. We were so used to explosions here in Pinole because of the Hercules Powder Company. They had a lot of explosions, and our house was, you know, plaster inside, and we were constantly fixing windows. I mean, they were repairing windows and cracks constantly because the explosions did damage the homes here a lot. But that one was really, really terrible.
Yeah, over 300 people died.
Yeah, 321, I think they said.
Well, we've gone 5 minutes over, and I know you have a long drive back to Folsom. Is there anything else you'd like to add today?
No, unless there's something else that
Well,
we didn't cover that
well,
you had in mind.
Well, you can always...
Since I was not a native Richmonder, but spent a good part of my life, you know, back and forth to Richmond with school and working there, I was very familiar with Richmond, but, and I think that most of the people here in town were familiar with Richmond and had lots of Richmond friends, so it was a big part of my life, and having worked there so much.
And what is your image of Richmond today?
I hope it can restore itself a bit. I really do, because it's a prime spot with the bay and close to San Francisco. It has so many good things, pretty hills, you know, up in Mira Vista, the hillside of Richmond. It's a pretty city, and I hope that things will halfway go back to what they used to be. I'm sure things will never be the same. That's with anything you're dreaming. If you think it will always be like it used to be, those things don't always happen. But there's certainly opportunity for Richmond to become a nice city again, like it used to be. And I hope it happens, because I know there's a lot of new development down on the bay side and down where the park is, and I hope that it will start, that they will have a lot of restoration, because it is a pretty spot.
I promise this is my last question.
I'm enjoying talking to you.
Good.
I hope I haven't bored you with
Not
things
even,
that are not important at all.
No, not even a little bit. It's great. About 6 years ago you moved to Folsom?
Yes.
Well, how was that move for you, and do you miss the Bay Area?
Well, we have 2 sons. The one who lives in this house here, he's on disability, had a serious heart attack. Our younger son is a California Highway Patrolman, and he has a wife and 2 children who are going to be 11 and 12. They're 14 months apart, and we sort of wanted to be close to them. We were always there for our older granddaughter, who's now off to college at Biola in Southern California, and so he could see that Pinole was changing, you know, maybe not drastically like Richmond, but having grown up here, as you know, from the time we were children, it has changed a lot, and it didn't bother me, but my husband does not take change well. And so our son, Jim, said, why don't you get away from there? That hillside is too much for, you know, for Dad. And he has, having worked around asbestos so much at the refinery, he has a lung problem. And so he kept looking for a place for us to move, and there was a little senior development going in. So we went up and looked at it and decided to move up there. And yes, it was hard to leave Pinole when you're born and raised in a small town and know everybody and everybody knows you, and you go to a totally new place. At our age was hard. We didn't miss the town itself, we missed the people. Yeah, we missed our friends here. But we do get back often, and I think that's the good part of it. We still keep in touch. And I have a sister here. One of them is still here, so we do keep in touch, and we email every other day or so, so we always know what's going on in Pinole.
Now, I promised that was my last question. However, you mentioned that your husband was affected by the asbestos.
Mm-hmm.
Well, many people I interviewed in my previous project had breathing problems,
Mm-hmm.
had lung problems, and some from working in the refinery, some from working in the shipyards. And is that a big problem for your husband? And
Well, he's done fairly well. He has a fibrositis, in one lobe of the lung, and they keep tabs on it. But he does pretty well. He got, this hillside, trying to work a hillside, and he's a dirt farmer. He loves to be out in the dirt, and he just would not have someone do it for him. So it was that, for that reason, it was a good thing to get away. And speaking of asbestos at the shipyards, I remember when I went out to pick up time cards out in the yards, I remember these little white particles floating around, and I didn't know at the time that had to have been, asbestos from all the asbestos they were using in the ships for insulation. But I remember it, and I think, what is that? It was almost like snow, little snowflakes in the air. So I'm sure those people that worked out in the yards did breathe a lot of bad air.
yeah, well, I've heard about people just coming home with the clothing, and then
Oh.
a family member would be doing the laundry and would get.
That has
Yeah.
happened to some acquaintances of my husband who were insulators and worked with asbestos all the time, and they brought home their clothing and the things, the rag they used, almost like a dish towel type material to wrap the asbestos in, and they'd bring it home, and their wives would wash it and bleach them out and clean them and use the cloth. And there have been more than a couple cases that I know of that have they're either gone now or are critically ill from it.
Does the name Vera Jones Bailey ring a bell to you? I think she was, because she lived in Pinole, and I know she lost her husband and was having some problems herself too.
That name doesn't ring a bell, but my husband's had a lot. He was a superintendent out at the refinery, and so he was out, on shutdowns, and whenever they removed asbestos from the piping, it was always just floating through the air. So, but they didn't realize how serious it was,
Right. Well, any special ambitions now, places you'd like to go or things you'd like to do?
No, I think at our age we're just happy to be halfway healthy and retired and enjoying our grandchildren, and our two sons are still alive, and we have a daughter, really nice daughter and former daughter-in-law that I still consider a daughter-in-law. So we have a nice family, and our family is close, so we're happy just doing that. We took an Alaskan cruise a couple of years ago, and that was our last one. We've taken 5, but we're kind of leery of flying, chicken now with the world situation, and so we've stayed kind of close to home.
Well, I want to thank you very much, and if I had been able to reach you the last few days, I would have asked you if you had any other pictures from, the early Richmond days or when you worked in the shipyards. And if if you haven't thrown those out, maybe the next time, or one of the times you come up in the next several months, maybe Catherine and I can come by and photograph them. I mean, we could do it right on the video,
Oh,
so we wouldn't have
you
to.
can do that, okay?
Mhm.
I'll check with my sisters.
Okay.
And then if I do have your phone number, which I'll
Mhm.
keep, and if you want something mailed to you, I could, do I use that address? The
Yeah, that would
oral
be-
history
Yes, that would be
that
fine.
You see?
Mhm.
Okay.
And you know, we could even get your sisters together and do a little.
Yeah,
Little taping.
I think Celeste would do a good job, and I told her that, you know, you had suggested maybe would she be interested, and she said, oh no. She's just really, I think, a little bit shy and doesn't want to do anything like this.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate your taking the time. And
Well, it was a pleasure. I enjoyed doing this. It was a nice experience. It's fun. Maybe I can talk my sister into doing
Good.
it too.
tell her it didn't hurt.
No, it didn't hurt at all, and you make it so easy. I just hope I haven't bored you.
No,
with
no,
things
not
that
at all.
You're
Not
not
at-
concerned with.
This is, you know, this is pretty informal, and no one really can have a wrong answer.
Yeah, well, when you asked about Victory Gardens, I remembered our little house down here below this hill. We had a row, we had lettuce, and we had carrots, and we had other vegetables, grew all the vegetables that we could grow, and even potatoes. And so that, you know, the only thing, and then if we had chickens and rabbits, that dollar pot roast from the meat market on Sunday was about the only meat that we bought at the meat market, because we had to be pretty self-sufficient with rationing. You didn't have, you know, that much you could get without food stamps. I forgot, coffee was another rationed item, just came to me. But we
Thank you.
managed.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, my pleasure. History for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And if you'd like to see two that I thought were, I think these are the two that I did. This one
Mm-hmm.
and this one. Your Richmond Shipyard memorabilia was $5 and white gloves.
In this photograph, Arlette is fourth from the right.
She's in the checkered suit. That was the one that my sister was the
Arlette.
flower girl at Samuel Gompers. And they give the name on each of these, so you'll know which ship belongs to which pictures.
And how would one become a flower girl for the ship?
Good question.
I think you had to have a nice job.
Mm-hmm.
And my sister Celeste, being a native Brazilian, was chosen for that one where the lady in the looks like she has a mink coat on. She was a Brazilian delegate to something, I don't know. Her husband was some dignitary, Brazilian dignitary. When they found out that she was going to be launching, you know, cracking the champagne bottle, they asked Celeste to be flower girl because she was Brazilian. Launched the ship, so that's why she got chosen for that one. These I just had done at, they're not very good copies. They were done at Staples, the last minute, day before yesterday.
I appreciate you going to that trouble.
Well, I didn't want to give Arlette's, I asked her to send copies, but she said she didn't have time to do it, so.
Okay, these are your originals, so I'll put these over here.